Hey Akshat, welcome to Network Capital. It's a pleasure to be hosting you today and discussing your book. But before we get to your book, could you start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do today?
I'm Akshat Rathi, and I'm a senior reporter for Bloomberg News here in London. I grew up in India, and I did chemical engineering as my first degree in India before studying for a PhD in organic chemistry here in the UK at Oxford University. And then decided not to pursue the path of becoming a professor and instead became a journalist. So I've been a journalist for 11 years now. And for 7 of those 11 years, I've written mostly about climate change and climate solutions.
What got you interested in climate change and climate solutions?
Very oddly, it was actually Donald Trump because at a time in 2016-17, he was campaigning around this term called clean coal, which
Mm-hmm.
my editors were very curious, what is it? And I explained it to them that he doesn't understand it, but there is an actual technology behind it that has been around for 50 years. And they were like, wow, you should definitely write about it. So I ended up starting with sort of a type of solution to tackle climate change. And since then, I think my beat has become covering climate solutions or false solutions. So things that work and to point to things that seem to work actually work.
No, that's very fascinating. But before we get into the book and some of the ideas, talk to us about this journey of being someone who had fairly set career in STEM or academia to getting into popular nonfiction writing. Was it easy, obvious? Was it confusing, messy? How did it actually unfold?
Yeah, it's I wouldn't say it was straightforward, but it was also not super confusing in that sense. I used to write as a hobby. Even when I was in undergrad in Mumbai, I had started a magazine with a few friends of mine in college. And I continued to do that even at Oxford. I used to do student journalism. So it wasn't completely alien for me to want to write. I enjoyed the process. And it felt like I could use what were science skills learned over many years and put it to good use because I feel like science is a subject that can do with specialist knowledge and can benefit from having people with specialist knowledge writing about it. So that's how I started. I got an internship at The Economist, so it was sort of learning about journalism on the job. And then continuing to stay in the field, which has been a good fortune to come by. It's not easy to have good journalism jobs around. And so I've been lucky and yeah, I've enjoyed my time.
And how did the book come about? I mean, you mentioned sort of Trump being, in a way, the catalyst of you thinking about this, but how was the process of writing the actual book?
Yeah. So around 2019, by that time, I'd been writing about solutions broadly for some time. I recognized that there was sort of a gap between what people thought where we are on tackling climate change, which is nowhere and not enough is being done, and terrible things are going to happen, versus lots of things actually being done. And yes, terrible things were going to come, but they were going to be less terrible than what could have been had these solutions not scaled. And so my goal with the book was to try and show success stories around the world, which I had been seeing in my reporting, and to show that it's possible to try and work the system as flawed as it is right now, but deliver something that would be beneficial and will actually make a meaningful difference in reducing emissions. That, these big goals, these global diplomatic goals that have been set for us that, are very jargon. They're like 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius, and people meet every year to talk about the nitty-gritty of it. Those are actually quite achievable, and almost everybody has agency to support those goals.
Are you optimist or a pessimist when it comes to our climate futures?
I'm a pragmatist, and to me, the reason for writing the book was to show that solutions are possible and that the way to the meeting climate goals is not impossible, that there are people doing it. And if anything, so far the progress that we have seen on climate goals has come despite the many, many barriers that have been put forward by the fossil fuel industry, by sort of the global north-south divide. And so if we can come to this point based on that, overcoming those barriers, then the future is better, because if anything, those barriers become smaller because technology is getting cheaper, is getting cheaper, wind is getting cheaper, electric cars and batteries are getting cheaper. And those economic forces, but certainly will help speed up the transition.
No, that makes sense. I know your book is on sort of climate capitalism. It's not just about climate change and its solutions. Um, to begin with, why climate capitalism? Do you believe, what are your thoughts on capitalism for climate change?
The basic idea of the book was to try and see whether there's this common refrain in the environmental community, which is capitalism caused this problem. So tackle climate, unless we tackle capitalism, we are not going to be able to solve this problem. And to me, that felt like something I wasn't seeing in the market, which is to say, there was already solutions being deployed. And so I was curious whether you really did need a new economic system and what it would be. And pretty much all the people I've spoken to who are working on these solutions, including anti-capitalists like Noam Chomsky, recognize that this problem comes with a time limit, that you have to reach net zero by 2050, ideally sooner for rich countries, a little bit later for countries like India. But within those few decades that are left to reach net zero, there is just no possibility of coming up with an economic system that is an alternative that nobody has defined, that can be deployed not just in one country, but everywhere. And so is it possible to use the current system and tweak it so that it can work on solutions? And rather than making a theoretical case for it, which some others have made, I wanted to show success stories around the world, in India, in China, in Denmark, in the US, and the UK, where you are actually tweaking the system as it exists to provide solutions.
Could you talk to us about one of these success stories, and not just the story in itself, but sort of how you discovered and stumbled onto them? Because, like you rightly pointed out, right, these are not really the stories you see when you read about climate change. I'd rather say you see the opposite. You see um, sort of the climate activists talking about how things are going bad. You see climate protests happening across the world. You see, funnily enough, historic buildings being vandalized because they want to get attention to climate issues. So, how do you find them, and how reflective are they of the climate reality as well? Or are they sort of the rare or edge cases? Are they more the norm or somewhere in between?
I think one thing to recognize is that we live now in a two-track world. One track on which climate impacts are going to keep getting worse because we continue to put greenhouse gases into the air and we continue to warm the planet. The hotter it gets, extreme weather events will get worse. That's just basic pure science, nothing you can do about it until you reach net zero. And so the message you get from activists today is not a false message. It is actually a true message, and it does not get the kind of attention, as in climate emergency in general, does not get the kind of attention that it deserves. There's a concept known as slow violence. So when wars happen, obviously people are being killed, and we currently are going through two wars, at least in the world. And those make massive headlines for good reason, because people are being killed. But slow violence is one where people are also being killed, but that's such a regular occurrence that nobody cares about it anymore. Air pollution in India is a very good example. It kills people, and yet we don't talk about it enough. We don't think about it as a war on our own citizens. And so we must recognize that that is what the goal of the activists is, to try and point to the fact that there is a lot of harm that climate change is already creating, and that the solutions to it are not being deployed at scale to deal with that emergency. And then the second track is to recognize that there has been progress so far. When the Paris Agreement, which is what helped bring all the countries in the world together to act on these problems, was signed in 2015, the world was on track to be warmed by 4 or 5 degrees Celsius relative to industrial levels. Today, it's on track to be warmed by 3 degrees Celsius. So we've shaved off a pretty horrible future that could have been. 3 degrees Celsius is still pretty horrible. For India, it's going to be absolutely terrible. And so there is so much more to be done to bring it down to 2 degrees Celsius and ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius. But we just have to recognize both these tracks exist, that we are making progress and that we are not making enough progress.
And what about the example? Could you share one of the examples from your book and sort of how you discovered that example as well?
So a good example would be to pick an India example. I wanted to understand whether India is a country that does not invent most of these green technologies, did not invent solar panels or batteries, does not have quite the financial capacity of a Germany to give tons and tons of subsidies to build solar panels, or has yet the manufacturing capacity of China to be able to make solar panels at the scale that the country demands. Can that country, which does not have any of these three things, still scale a technology like solar because India has so much sun and it has a growing population, it has a growing need for electricity, all things that are necessary for it to grow. And so I wanted to understand whether that's happening. And it was, and I wanted to find how exactly the people who are making it happen work through a system which can be difficult. Doing business in India is much harder than doing business in the UK. And so I profiled Renew Power, or Renew Now. That is a company which is one of the largest deployers of renewable energy in India, and its founder, Sumant Sinha, who grew up in India, studied in the US, worked in the financial industry in the US before coming back to India, and how he was able to map financial expertise from to bringing in capital from the likes of Goldman Sachs to help scale and build Renew Power into the company it has become, despite the difficulties that working in India and working in an Indian business context presents.
And how did you stumble onto the Renew Power story of the way they're changing? Was it your interest in solar powers that got you interested in it, or were you looking at sort of alternative energy sources and they might be one of the bigger players in India right now?
So in theory, India and its clean energy goals are very much going to be fulfilled by solar power, because solar is just the cheapest source of energy. Not all of it, but a lot of electricity supply in the future is going to come from solar power. That was clear to me by the time I was thinking about looking at how solar is scaling in India. The other advantage was Prime Minister Modi had set a goal for a certain level of solar deployment to happen in the country by 2022. And so it's always a good way to assess whether that goal is on track and who are the big players that are making a difference. And so I started looking at the story in 2017, 2018, and found in Sumant Sinha somebody who I could tap and learn from, and at the time was the largest company doing this, and had brought in foreign capital to be able to help scale the technology. And so that's how the story came about.
Great, that's really interesting. The other side, though, is in tech, in business, and even in a lot of other spaces, there's this idea of greenwashing these days to appear
Mm-hmm.
to be more environmentally conscious, to be more sustainable, despite not really having any difference or change in the original way things are done. Um, how do you make sense of that and then reconcile it with these ideas, right? Because I think one part when you originally were introducing the book was also telling people, okay, these are actually the good ideas and this is how they're scaling. Um, And I sort of countered it by saying that most of what we see are actually very gloomy doomsday scenario. In between, there is this tiny world where people act environmentally conscious. Most business have some climate strategy, even though they might not be working in climate. They might talk about how they're reducing the electricity spent and so on. In your opinion, is this greenwashing good? Is it at least making people more conscious of the environment, although they might not be acting upon it yet? Do you see it largely bad because they're abdicating the work they're supposed to do, or is it also somewhere in between?
Well, one way to think about the recognition of greenwashing is that 10, 20 years ago, nobody talked about it, and now people are at least talking about it.
Yeah.
So clearly, the interest has grown, and that's the reason why there is more greenwashing. And so, again, it's sort of like the two-track world where there clearly has been progress. Now, greenwashing is not good progress, but it shows that there's interest in trying to at least cater to a population that wants to see climate solutions being
Yeah.
deployed, whether you're a business or not. Um, and the nice thing is that we kind of now have become more aware of the fact that companies can greenwash, right? Greenwashing is only called greenwashing until it's recognized as greenwashing. Until then, people think it's a good thing, right? Until then, people think what you're claiming is happening. And so we've gotten better at being able to call people out, call companies out for not living up to the big claims that they are drawing. And that requires a level of investigation and sophistication and understanding of information that is a good thing to see in the world among journalists, among not-for-profits that are able to suss out greenwashing and point to it. The other thing that's happening, and not so much in India yet, but hopefully soon, is regulators are coming in and making places like the UK and the European Union, there are now specific laws around the use of terms like carbon neutral or sustainability that you have to back up with real actionable outcomes that you have done with your company so that you can make these claims. Otherwise, you cannot make these claims. And that kind of regulation coming in will only help try and tamp down on greenwashing and make companies be focused on actual solutions that are available, that are slightly maybe more expensive, but in the long run will pay for both in helping them reduce their own energy bills, their own emissions, but also the planet.
No, absolutely. Talk to us about sort of the media ecosystem around climate change, right? I think most people who will look at media and journalism today that would say that a little like climate change, journalism is also in a state of crisis. I think people are figuring out what does truth and reality look in a post-truth world. How do you trust and accept the sources and means of information that you're getting? Do you see this similar approach in the world of climate media as well? How do you see people engaging with climate media overall?
So in some way, climate actually has a much longer history of misinformation and disinformation than pretty much any section of journalism. And that's because in the 90s, the fossil fuel industry created an entire propaganda arm to try and sow doubt about climate science and to slow down climate action. This is very well documented in multiple investigations that have been done in multiple academic papers that have been reported since. And that had real major impact because that caused the US government to not sign off on global treaties that could have started to reduce emissions as early as 1995. And that led to what we are seeing, at least in the US, which is now the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases and the largest historical emitter of greenhouse gases. This two-party system where one believes in climate change and one doesn't, even though the science is absolutely clear. And so a lot of damage was done through misinformation and disinformation by actors intended to try and slow down climate action in the 90s. So what has happened since is that climate scientists and journalists have become smarter at being able to counter that misinformation and disinformation to be able to tell you a much more informed, better story. Now we are seeing a lot of that, post-truth world. I still don't think we're quite there. Hopefully, we'll never be there in the post-truth world because um, without reality, what do we have? But yes, there's clearly more fake news and there's clearly more trouble in how social media is being used as a tool for weaponizing information. Um, but because climate scientists and journalists were at the forefront of dealing with this, it gives me some hope that they will be able to tackle this new wave of misinformation a little bit better than political journalists who are probably newer to this problem than some of the science journalists are.
No, absolutely. Another thing is also the way different sort of sections of people deal with climate change varies because of their context, right? So let's start with geographic differences.
Mhm.
What are some of the differences you've observed in different geographies, both economically and maybe even culturally responding to climate change?
Yeah,
For example, and the cliche one would be that a global south is more affected than the north. So do you see any differences in that?
yeah. Hard to answer the question in a generalized way, given how diverse the world is and how diverse people's experiences are. But perhaps I can take a few examples to showcase the complexity and the nuance. So a good example is Puerto Rico. Now, Puerto Rico technically is not an American state, but all Puerto Ricans have the ability to be American citizens. And so you could consider it to be like the 51st state. However, as a 51st state of the United States of America, it is very different when it comes to its economic potential because its people are much poorer. They earn half or a third of what the average American earns. And it is a state that is very vulnerable to climate change. It gets hammered by hurricanes every so often, and those hurricanes are getting more intense because of climate change. And so we see that even in a rich country like America, there are portions of its own vast landscape where people are much poorer and are much more vulnerable to climate impacts than somebody in the middle of America living in a sparsely populated, richer environment. And so the people in Puerto Rico experience climate change and want to make their voice heard on climate change in a very different way than you would expect from a typical sort of rich developed country experience, because that's the nuance at which diversity within a specific country exists. However, the other thing to say about sort of cultural divide is that climate denialism, the sort of misinformation, disinformation that we talked about, only really exists at any significant way in countries like the US, UK, Australia. It doesn't quite exist in India. It doesn't quite exist in Indonesia. So the countries that are Anglophiles that sort of have this colonial history have been sort of being usurped by this misinformation, disinformation campaign. Countries like India yet haven't, because to them the economic impacts are kind of there and real, and the economic opportunities are there and real. And so for India to act on climate is sort of acting in self-interest now. And so you don't see this backlash that you see in other political actors in developed countries.
No, that makes sense. And would similar insights hold true for generational approaches to climate change as well? Do you have any examples on generational differences in how um, d- age influences your understanding and relationship with climate change?
Certainly does, right? Like when I grew up in India, right? So, and I knew climate change kind of existed in um, as a thing in science textbooks in high school, but just, it was a small section in your geography textbook and you moved on. Now it's much more included in basic education across the world. And so you're seeing the difference. You're seeing people who protest are typically younger people who understand that it is their future that's going to be affected, and pretty drastically if people don't do anything about it. There are also people without the power and influence that richer and older people have in the world, and those people are likely not going to suffer from the kind of impact that young people would. So there is a clear generational divide just in principle because young people will suffer more and old people won't. And you're seeing that in the political outcomes of how people vote for climate-oriented leaders or not.
No, and I mean, the one example you mentioned about sort of climate education, I can think of is that when I was in school, we used to have something called acid rain in our books, which, as far as I know, is not as important or as concerning a thing anymore as it used to be.
Correct. Yes, because the acid rain is basically where the use of sulfur-based fuels, or at least like petrol and gasoline with high sulfur, would then cause air pollution, and air pollution mixed with water when it rains would cause acid rain. A good example would be, how the Taj Mahal was becoming yellow because of acid rain. That is less of a problem now because we have become better at running engines much more efficiently, car engines, but also using fuels that are not using as much sulfur in them.
Yeah, exactly, because that's the Taj Mahal example is also what we had in our textbooks. And that is what I was coming to. So I think with things like climate change or issues like climate change, sometimes these examples and these points of references matter more, right? Because and maybe to some degree, even the visual image that they bring to you. So this is a slightly subjective question, and you can take it as you want. What is the kind of image that you'd like to paint for us? What is that sort of example or point of reference that you think will do justice or will be an appropriate example of thinking of our current climate change situation?
So one way to think about it, before I give you the sort of like the picture to keep in mind, is to recognize the problem in a way that is typically not recognized. So one reason for me to write this book was to try and point out that even as impacts are getting worse right now and people are dying because of climate impacts today, the scale at which more people and how like millions and billions of people will be affected in the future is vastly more than what we are experiencing today. And that is likely to have an impact on progress metrics that we have taken for granted in India. I grew up at a time when poverty was declining, hunger was declining, um, economic growth was booming, opportunities to be able to do things, not just in India, but abroad. I live in London now, were growing. All those progress metrics are likely to start to reverse. We are already seeing a backlash on immigration in many of the Western countries, English-speaking countries, and how difficult it has become to try and secure visas to be able to work there. You're already seeing global poverty increase, partly because of what happened in the pandemic. You're seeing global hunger increase, and that happened even before the pandemic. And those progress metrics are likely to reverse even further. Women's rights are likely to be affected because of climate impacts, which affect women disproportionately more than they affect men. And so I wanted to make sure that through understanding of climate solutions and our ability to try and tackle the problem, we might be able to hopefully not reverse those progress metrics. So the picture to keep in mind is this, which is tackling climate change isn't about helping rich Western countries be absolved of the problems that caused climate change, because they were the ones who put out much of the greenhouse gas emissions. It is squarely in the self-interest of countries like India to act on climate change, both to be able to preserve the level of progress that the country has been able to make and will continue to make if they tackle climate change, but also that the future is one where if you build the industries that are going to dominate the future, these are solar, wind, batteries, electric cars, then you as a country have a advantage in a world where people are going to want those technologies. We're clearly seeing China take that mantle right now, but we are at such an early stage of the transition. The total number of electric cars in the world is about 2% of all cars in total. So 98% of the transition is still left, and there's a huge amount of opportunity for countries like India to tap into. And so tackling climate change doesn't just avoid pretty bad impacts, it also builds a better world. You don't just get fewer flooding events and fewer drought events, but you actually get clean air, you get cleaner water, and all of those things are good for humanity, and we should aim to have them.
That's very fascinating. But shifting gears a little again and coming back to the writing of the book, um, writing about a topic as complex as climate change is difficult, especially attempting to write a book that sort of covers the different nuances like we've discussed so far. What was the process of just structuring the book, like putting all these ideas and all these interviews and case studies together in a way that it makes sense both to someone who might have no idea about climate change and someone who's decently familiar and aware?
So it is a hard challenge, and it's kind of the fun of writing the book, because it is a big, broad topic, and you have to be able to tell it in a way that would make sense for a reader. A book has a start and a middle and a finish, and so you have to find something that will hold the reader for all that time. It is a significant amount of time commitment somebody makes to read a book. And so you need to make it compelling so that they can keep going. And all those things are things that I do for short articles and short features or long features on a day-to-day basis. But writing a book, just 10, 12, 15 times the size is just a much harder enterprise. So what I found most useful was to try and give people characters to show the stories. So each of the chapter is typically focused on one person doing something to show how their influence in this big, vast complex has been crucial for moving the ball on, say, electric cars in China or solar in India or wind in Denmark. But to show it within the context of how things will help them understand those problems. So in India, for example, I explain not just how a solar panel works from a scientific basis, but I also explain the cost of capital and why interest rates matter so much to a country like India when you're investing there. In the chapter on the UK, I explain how laws can be built to be able to be ready for a climate future, and how the UK's Climate Change Act came about and why it is such a systematic one that is now being copied by countries like New Zealand, France, Sweden, and so many more. And so it is a big, broad topic, but then bringing it down to stories and examples and case studies and people really helped me nail down how to make it readable and how to help people continue to want to know what's going to happen next.
And it's been about a week now since the book is out. How's the reception been like? Have you received any interesting feedback or review or just thoughts on the book?
Yeah, it's been quite fun so far. I've got media attention across the globe. My goal was to write a book that would be global and will have interest from around the world, because the topic is global, the problem is global, the opportunities are global. So yeah, I've had conversations in Australia, in Singapore, in India, in the UK, but I've also traveled to Amsterdam. I'm going to travel to Spain later in the month. And I've done a number of events in London. So it's been pretty fascinating. The book hasn't come out in America yet, or North America. So that is one region that I'm hoping to cater to when it comes out in March. But it's been fascinating. The thing I've enjoyed most has been the level of sophistication and nuanced in people's understanding of this problem. I'm a journalist. I write for people to be able to bridge the gap between what they know and what they should know. And to me, it's always an interesting exercise in learning from people what questions they have so that I can understand where they are right now and what are the stories that would be most helpful to them. And I've just been very pleasantly surprised by how much more understanding of this topic and how much more understanding of the challenges and the opportunities that we have to tackle climate change that exists now in the population. And I hope it only gets better.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, climate also becomes very personal. So that helps in sort of building a average threshold of understanding. In the final segment, I just wanted to talk about careers a little, both careers in climate and sort of your approach to careers. So let's start with careers in climate. I think I know there's an entire field of climate education that's coming up, which looks at how do you build resilience and climate resilience in people. How do you look at, I think there's something called, I recently read green jobs, and the idea of like both climate resilient jobs and jobs that work to address climate change, both. Are you seeing or observing any new changes or trends in this world of green jobs?
100%. One fact that I came across a few years ago now, but it continues to surprise people when I tell them, is that there are now more people employed by the renewable energy industry than by the fossil fuel industry globally. Um, and that's already happening at a level where renewable energy industry is yet to really make a huge impact. It's not the majority source of energy yet. And so there's so much more room for people to work in the renewable energy industry as it grows even further. So already we are seeing that, if anything, countries like America have a shortage of many of the jobs that are needed for green industries. Electricians and plumbers are very hot jobs in America, for example. And so right now, it's not that they can't pay for their solar panel, it's that they can't get the electrician to come in time to be able to install the solar panel. So there is a whole suite of jobs that is coming up, and it's not just in the renewable energy industry. Pretty much every major company now has a sustainability department, is now focused on figuring out how they can reduce emissions, how they can think across their company to come up with those solutions, how they can use clean energy to reduce their own energy bills. And even if your job within a company isn't oriented towards climate, there is enough to do within your company to ask somebody whether you can be a part of this, because it's such a company-wide exercise when you have to do sustainability and net zero goals properly. So in terms of opportunities, again, you can pick any sector if you like, and I can talk you through where the opportunities might lie in taking part and being employed in trying to solve this problem.
No, I think that way you're right. I think each sector has its own opportunities, sort of with the more traditional source of way things are done, taking a seat versus newer, more greener options, slowly but surely rising. Coming to your own career, I know we started with discussing you living over Mumbai, Oxford, and now London, going from chemistry and academia to journalism, and now being an author. What do you think you'll be working on next? Have you thought about it? And how do you see your own career sort of progressing?
So right now, I'm still quite focused on climate solutions and fall solutions, and it's a beat that for me has been a different one every year I've covered it. So I could see more opportunities in staying and writing more about this. What I will start to focus on is that in the book, there are solutions that are working at scale. The goal was to try and show success stories of solar, wind, batteries, electric cars, but also laws, finance, international institutions, um, and how they are helping solve the problems. But that's not the whole solution set. There's a whole other solution set that we need. We need to understand whether hydrogen is going to be a part of it, what happens to lab grown meat, but also more sort of systemic problems, such as how do you find routes to transfer billions and trillions of dollars of investment from developed countries into developing countries. It's a solution we haven't really solved and we need to solve if we want to reach net zero. So I'm hoping to chase all those sort of budding solutions that haven't quite succeeded yet. And also write about false solutions. So in the book, I don't go at all into solutions that don't work, but carbon offsets are a good example. Carbon capture is another good example, sort of is supposed to work, but does not work because of the system in which it exists. And so I will continue to write about that.
That's really fascinating. Actually, we didn't get into the false examples bit, and I think maybe that we can keep for the next conversation. I think that continues maybe on the greenwashing line, but is a world of its own. Um,
Yes.
Akshat, thank you so much for your time. Before we conclude, do you have any parting note for our audience?
Well, my hope with the book was to try and tell people that successes are all around us if we want to look at them. But crucially, that if you engage with the solutions, you will see that the problem is solvable, and you will see you have the agency to act on it. So I'm hoping people will engage with the book. I am very keen on people reaching out to me and telling me what they found interesting, what they disagreed with, what they thought was wrong, because that's my goal, to try and learn from writing this and getting the feedback so that I can do a better job in the future. So I hope people read Climate Capitalism. It's available everywhere now. And get in touch with me once you've had a chance to read it.
No, absolutely. We'll make sure a link of the book is shared with this masterclass, and Network Capital members all over the world get to read it.
Thank you.